Welcome to the second event of this year's Passover programming from the Cloud Library in Cincinnati, Tzafun, the behind-the-scenes work of repairing the 1526 Prague Haggadah. My name is Jordan Finken. I'm the Rare Book and Manuscript Librarian here at the Cloud Library, home to one of the premier Judaica library collections in the world. Let me begin with just a few words about the object that we'll be talking about today, and then I'll turn it over to the real expert. Illuminated, illustrated, and decorated Haggadot have been produced and used in Europe since the Middle Ages. And while Hebrew printing began less than a generation after the advent of movable type printing in general, it wasn't until the early 16th century that attempts at more than rudimentarily illustrated printed Haggadot appeared. It wasn't, however, until 1526 that a truly fully illustrated printed Haggadah came onto the market. Prague was the birthplace of Hebrew printing outside of the Mediterranean basin. A printing press was founded there in 1512, and our protagonists, the printers Gershom HaKohen Katz, his brother Grunem, and Chaim Schwartz, also known as Chaim Shachor, joined the firm 2 years later. They produced a number of books there, but decided sometime after 1518 to go independent, as it were, and embarked on their ambitious Haggadah project, and brought Chaim Schwartz along as a freelance artisan onto the project. The images are lavish and have had a lasting impact on Haggadah iconography ever since, sealing the imagery of the manuscript tradition within the new and revolutionary technology of print. The Cloud Library's copy of this book came into the collection possibly around a century ago, and as you will see, in rather poor condition. The library recently received a very generous donation for its conservation, in honor of which we are presenting this review of the efforts to conserve the book and maintain it as a treasured object of Jewish cultural heritage for future generations. It is now my distinct pleasure to be able to introduce today's speaker. For over a decade, Ashley Schieser has been affiliated with the Preservation Lab, a cooperative institution between the University of Cincinnati and the Public Library of Cincinnati in Hamilton County. There she is the rare book and paper conservator of special collections, as well as the lab's co-manager. Ashley's passion for conservation began in wallpaper conservation and was strengthened while gaining preservation project management experience during the opening of the Musical Instrument Museum in Arizona. Ashley holds an MA in art conservation from Buffalo State College, and she acquired library materials and conservation experience at the Huntington Library, the Leather Conservation Center, the Boston Athenaeum, and the University of Kansas Libraries. Ashley has led several important conservation projects for the Cloud Library, and she is a gifted conservator, expert, and consummate professional. So please join me in welcoming Ashley and a behind-the-scenes look at her conserving the Cloud Library's 1526 Prague Haggadah.
Well, Jordan, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, and happy Passover, everyone. I'm excited to share this project with you today. As Jordan said, I'm Ashley Ferguson Schieser. I'm a book and paper conservator specializing in the conservation of albums and books. And I'm just going to share my screen real quick and pop up the presentation. Okay. Oops, excuse me. Great. So today I'm going to discuss a multi-year treatment performed on a 16th century Haggadah owned by Hebrew Union College that contains both printed text and handwritten manuscript. Just advancing the slides, there we go. So Hebrew Union College is located less than a mile from where I work on the University of Cincinnati campus at the Preservation Lab, where we take on limited third-party institutional work. So for those of you not familiar, the Preservation Lab is a collaborative hybrid lab. Collaborative means we're a shared department between the Cincinnati and Hamilton County Public Library and the University of Cincinnati Libraries. And hybrid means we treat both general collections and special collections. So that's both materials that you check out and those that you visit within the reading room. We're equally managed, staffed, and funded by the public library and the university, and we care for all types of materials at both institutions. When we're fully staffed, we consist of 2 co-managers and 5 support staff with about 4 to 5 student workers. For example, I'm a public library employee and I co-manage the lab with the University of Cincinnati preservation librarian, but it doesn't matter what institution we're from. We all care for the collections from both institutions based on our skill set and expertise. And some of the services that we provide include repairing collections for digitization, research, and exhibition. We perform preventative conservation, which includes monitoring the collections environment. We engage in education and outreach. And one of the great benefits of the collaboration is we have shared disaster response resources. So if you're interested in learning more about the lab and what we do, I encourage you to check out our website. From there, you can navigate to a lot of our online resources. We have a blog where we share research and preservation solutions. Instagram highlights our day-to-day activities. And there's a YouTube channel that showcases some of the specialized conservation documentation that we perform. We also share our treatment documentation online on the University of Cincinnati's Digital Resource Commons page, which we refer to as the DRC. And the DRC houses treatment reports and photography, including some from Hebrew Union College's collection. So to find those reports, you'd head to the landing page, scroll down to the bottom, and you would click on the community that says Other Cultural Heritage Institutions. And there's a few reports listed from the presentation today. Okay, so before I jump into talking about the treatment of the 1526 Prague Haggadah, I wanted to preface and reiterate some of what Jordan had already discussed, and talk about what is a Haggadah, the historical importance of the 1526 Prague text, and showcase 2 other treatments performed by the Preservation Lab of Haggadahs. It's interesting to note how they relate to the treatment you'll hear about today. So including the Haggadah in the subject of today's talk, the lab has treated 3 of Hebrew Union College's Haggadot, ranging from the 16th through the 18th centuries. And all Haggadah are leather bound, but they vary in their importance and composition of their text block. All right. So the Haggadah, as we probably all know, is central to the Jewish Passover. It's written in Hebrew script, which is read right to left. So you might notice the organization of some of my slides reflecting this. And the Haggadah is read during the Seder ritual meal, and it outlines an order of activities. Because these books are heavily used around the dinner table, it's customary for Haggadah pages to be dirty and food smeared. And so this evidence of use is an important part of the history of a Haggadah and is preserved during treatment. At the end of a Seder meal, practices traditionally end in song. And I wanted to point this out because these songs are often included in a Haggadah. However, songs were not printed in the Prague text until 1590. Because of this, at some point in the 1526 binding's history, a group of manuscript leaves with handwritten songs were sewn into the back of the printed text block. And you can see a couple of those manuscript leaves on the slide in front of you. As Jordan mentioned, the Prague text from 1526 is significant as it's the earliest fully illustrated printed Haggadah. It was printed in Prague by the brothers Gershom Cohen and Gronem Katz in 1526. There are over 60 woodblock prints throughout that are attributed to the creation of Chaim Schwartz. And other features include decorative initials and short interpretations in the page's margins. So it's really neat to see varying types of all different sizes. And the woodcut imagery within these pages served as a model for future printed Haggadah, and so it's had an enormous influence on the history of Haggadah illustration going forward. All right, so this slide shows the very first treatment performed by the Preservation Lab of a Hebrew Union College Haggadah. It's a 17th century printed text. It's bound in what are likely its original covers and sewing structure. And it was printed in Amsterdam and is the fourth copy owned by the college. However, it's HUC's only copy that contains hand-colored illumination. So as a result, the binding is frequently used in the reading room as a teaching tool, and it needed treatment to prevent the parts from becoming further damaged. The 1695 Amsterdam text is significant as it was the first time in the history of the Jewish book that copper engravings were used instead of woodcuts. And it contains influences of Christian imagery, such as those found in the Protestant Marian Bible. In the middle image, you can see hand-colored engravings by Abraham ben Jacob containing the figures Moses and Aaron, and their likeness to the print by the Swiss artist Matthias Marian. The Amsterdam Haggadah was revolutionary in its kind, and it still has the influence on the layout and illustrations of modern Haggadah. All right, so to treat this, the text was fully collated to document the original sewing structure. And after the text was repaired, it was resewn onto new and existing sewing supports. And bands were added to recreate lost parts of the original structure. And the missing leather was replaced with a new vegetable tanned goat skin that was dyed to match. This treatment was a great introduction for the lab to learn about the history of Haggadah. The next Haggadah treated by the lab is this 1716 Haggadah manuscript, which is a companion to the Van Gelderen Haggadah from 1723. Both were produced by Moses Loban Wolf, who's well known for his Jewish manuscript art. And these miniatures are oil on parchment, and they're based on the engravings found in the printed Amsterdam Haggadah of 1712. Treatment was similar to the prior conservation project with a few key differences. The text block was parchment, and its original sewing structure had been fully replaced with heavy-handed 20th century repairs. And these repairs needed to be carefully removed and the pages rebound with as little moisture as possible to preserve the flexibility of the animal's skin leaves. And I thought I'd add this as an interesting side note. The 1716 Haggadah was also received with this prior slipcase enclosure. The slipcase, you can see, has beautifully decorated blue paste paper inside and could possibly be original to the era of the binding. So we did preserve the leather, and we stored it in a new cloth-covered clamshell next to the binding. This way, the Haggadah could remain in context with the original enclosure, but wouldn't suffer any abrasion when it was being pulled in and out of the original case. All right, so now that you've seen other treatments that have come through the lab, we'll dive into the full details of the 1526 Prague Haggadah. So this is the earliest binding that's come through the lab. The 16th century Haggadah was received bound into a full leather binding. It suffered from degraded leather, cockled pages, and broken sewing. And it was clear at multiple points in this object history it had been reformatted since the pages consisted of differing dimensions. And in addition, sewing holes and leather impressions showed that the text block was originally sewn onto 6 raised sewing supports, despite being currently sewn onto 20th century flat sewing tapes. And this is really similar to how the 1716 parchment binding was resewn before it was treated. So in its current state, the printed text had been trimmed and mounted within larger paper frames. These paper frames had helped extend the sheet dimensions to fit within the dimensions of the leather covers. Over time, the mounting tape around the perimeter yellowed and darkened. The paper frames were cockled due to differing expansion and contraction rates to the printed leaves. And the songs were written with iron gall ink. The ink had showed advanced signs of corrosion, with the ink actually bleeding through the paper. Here's some pictures of that before treatment again. So you can see that the leather binding was beautiful. It might actually be contemporary to the manuscript. So we decided to pursue treatment to conserve all the parts and go ahead and rebind them into the existing covers. But before we did treatment, we went ahead and created a model so that I could propose a unique rebinding solution to recombine those different size pages. So as an alternative to inlaying the treated pages back into new paper frames, new polyester encapsulated pages were constructed in a way that they could be sewn through the folds next to the manuscript leaves. And this was done in a structure sympathetic, historical to the what we think was the original structure, in order to reuse those original leather covers. Another option would have been to rebind them in a traditional encapsulation format within new covers. And you can see an example of that on the bottom left of the screen, where there's an example of a screw post encapsulation binding that's within a new cloth covered case. So creating the model was really successful, I think, to help propose this unique solution. So I presented it to Jordan and Laurel excuse me, I'm having trouble talking. Laurel Wolfson and Jordan Finken. And it was really helpful for me as a conservator, because many lessons were actually learned, since this was a unique situation and a new process for me. I learned how to map out the welding process, which this consisted of creating nested polyester gatherings that were welded to paper hinges. I also learned how much I needed for an effective amount of stebbing near the gutter to compensate for that added thickness of polyester film. And this helps prevent the book from becoming wedge shaped, like you see on the slide in front of you. And there were structural binding considerations tested, such as creating a natural hollow so the spine actually pops away from the book, but it gave the appearance of how it would have originally been, tight back leather binding, while adding flexibility. And so in this case, it was especially helpful to protect the paper hinges of the encapsulated leaves from moisture during the rebinding process and rebacking. All right. So treatment began the printed leaves. The printed leaves were treated in 5 major stages. They were first immersion washed to remove tape. They were then in-painted to compensate for a visual loss of surface dirt. Tears were repaired. And then next, both the obvious and inconspicuous paper losses were filled before they were finally encapsulated. The printed leaves were both adhered to the paper frames with a water-soluble adhesive, and they were taped on top on the opposite side with a yellowed paper tape. So for the frame removal, the sheets were immersion washed, and paper losses along the edges and areas of dirt loss were actually revealed once those paper frames and the tape were removed. So all the leaves were washed to help deacidify until the bath water ran clear. But however, some leaves required more than one immersion in the bath to remove multiple layers of tape. You can see the yellow arrows showing additional areas of prior repairs that did not readily lift during the initial bath. And just as a side note, pages weren't surface planed prior to washing, like we had mentioned, prior to preserve the evidence of historical use. However, after the tape was removed, the yellow tape was very prominent when you saw the leaves, but after it was removed, those areas of dirt loss actually became more pronounced. Your eyes were drawn to them. And so to compensate for the dirt loss, since they were distracting, here's a few examples. These brighter beige areas were inpainted with watercolors and pastels. And so these are just a few bench details showing before and after inpainting before the paper was actually repaired. The losses in the paper were primarily filled with laminated layers of acrylic toned kozo tissue. But as you can see in the bottom left, there was a large rectangular cutout that needed additional structural support. And it was filled with a handmade Western paper that was specially toned with a gradation to match the dark edges of the page and the lighter tone in the center of the paper. Once the pages were repaired, because the printed leaves were smaller, the printed leaves were encapsulated to match the size of the encapsulated leaves. So 38 encapsulated pages were constructed to flexibly sew the smaller printed leaves next to the full-size manuscript. Once they were encapsulated, they could then be bound. So to create these sewn gatherings, folios of encapsulations were ultrasonically welted with Sekishu paper hinges. And this is a really long, fibered, strong, handmade paper. Groups of encapsulated folios were nested into gatherings of 4 folios. To accommodate the increase in folio size, as it wraps around the previous inner folio, the Sekishu hinges were cut into 4 different thicknesses. And the encapsulations were partially welded around the edge with an upper corner open so that the leaves could be removed for exhibition, digitization, or just general handling, should anybody want to experience the material outside of the plastic. And it was really helpful to have the book model, which served as good practice to learn how much to trim those inner margins to prevent them from catching and rubbing when the pages were turned. So this is just a nerdy conservation side note. The most painful part of the encapsulation process for me was actually cutting the encapsulated pages out of square that Chris had worked so hard to create. And this was done in order to fit the pages within the covers that were askew. They were not actually 90-degree angles. So to trim the edges of the sleeves, I removed, this is a chopping board shear that you see a picture of in the slide. I removed the gauge out of the track and I placed it at an angle identical to the obtuse corner of the manuscript leaves and secured it. And this is just surprisingly something I'd never had to do before. Okay, so now we're going to travel to treatment of the manuscript leaves. To treat the manuscript leaves that were suffering from the iron gall ink corrosion, wet treatment was performed. And this consisted of a pre-wash bath, followed by a bath of phytic acid mixed with calcium carbonate to chelate unstable Fe2 ions in that iron gall ink. The documents were then rinsed to remove any precipitate that formed from that chelating process. And then they were washed with a calcium carbonate bath for deacidification. And so this is essentially pre-mixing seltzer water with a calcium carbonate powder. So you can see all those bubbles forming in the bath. Last, the pages were sized with gelatin. And gelatin has been found to have beneficial effects on an iron gall ink document. It helps keep the chemical equilibrium favored toward Fe3 rather than the destructive Fe2. So this is the preferred material to use for resizing. Okay, so here's a comparison image of a treated iron galling folio overlaid on top of an untreated folio. This is an image of UVA fluorescence. And what it does is it shows the overall tone of the paper shifts from a yellow-green tone to more of a bluish tone, which isn't as easy to see under normal illumination. And also the ink was not found to shift or bleed through any more than before treatment. So I was really happy with how it had turned out. So the next stage of treatment was to create new end sheets to sandwich around the manuscript. So a handmade laid twin rocker paper was custom toned to rest against the manuscript leaves and the original marble papers. And one of the challenges for a conservator of toning Western paper is sometimes one side of the sheet really readily accepts a diluted acrylic paint while the other side does not. I found in this case that fully wetting out the paper before applying the pigment wash helped to alleviate this. But as luck would have it, because there were so many different types of paper in the text block, as luck would have it, it worked out in my favor since the tone of the printed sheets and the manuscript pages on either side were different colors. So these images show you that two-toned color of the end sheet and how it blends with both sides of paper on each side. So the text block parts and covers that were treated as separate objects were all now ready to come together. And the text consisted of one manuscript gathering, 5 gatherings of encapsulated pages, original marble papers, and new end sheets. To protect the manuscript and printed text from possible acidity in the retained marbled papers, new end sheet papers were hinged around those. So they just acted as a buffer. So the next step was to establish sewing stages for rebinding. The sewing holes were based off of holes discovered in the manuscript leaves. Because this had been rebound so many times, there was a few to pick from. So the sewing holes that were used were chosen because they were compared to the placement of the original sewing holes. And the yellow arrows point to the impression marks where the spine leather was once tied up around the prior sewing supports. And luckily, the impressions of the binding indicated a set of holes within the manuscript leaves were closely aligned with those sewing supports. So to me, this indicated that the boards may be original to when the manuscript leaves were added. And so as a result, new sewing holes were punched in the welded sleeves prior to rebinding, while existing sewing holes were reused in the manuscript leaves. So for rebinding, there were 2 types of paper guards added to the text block during resewing. There was a concertina guard, which is like an accordion folded fan that you can see on the right. It was created to protect the welded sleeves from a spine lining adhesive. And this is a similar technique used for rebinding parchment blocks, such as what I did in the 1716 Haggadah. And then I added 4 sizes of compensation V hinges, also known as free guards. These were created to rest in between the folios to help compensate for the added thickness of the welded leaves so that it didn't become wedge-shaped. The text was then sewn, we call it unpacked, on 6 cord supports. And after the spine linings were added, end bands were sewn onto cores of alum-tawed leather laminated to vellum. So using techniques and linings that are traditionally used for parchment text block treatment, the spine was lined with as little moisture as possible and immediately dried to prevent cockling of the paper hinges inside. 2 applications of a dry, unstrained wheat starch paste were applied to the concertina guard and allowed to fully dry before applying spine linings. So there was first paper linings of sekishu, like that handmade Asian fibered kozo tissue. These were adhered in between sewing supports with wheat starch paste. And then next, a slotted airplane linen was adhered overall with slots cut for the sewing supports. A twin rocker handmade laid paper panel was also adhered with wheat in between sewing supports to give it a little extra structure. Next, a custom molded spine was created out of cave paper to support a natural hollow leather structure, which gives it that appearance of a tight back binding, but provides flexibility so the spine can actually pop away when opened. And the molded paper spine had the added benefit to protect the spine from absorbing excess moisture during rebacking. And I'm showing you images of my model since I didn't actually document this molded spine process during the actual treatment. So for the cover repair, the board leather was stabilized and it was consolidated where it was worn and abraded. And there were deep areas of leather loss and some areas of board loss, which were filled with a pulped blotter. And these filled areas were further covered with a toned kozo tissue, and they were inpainted to improve visual cohesiveness and give the appearance of leather. A new orange toned calf leather was selected for rebacking with a surface grain similar to the original. It was custom dyed with celoderm leather dyes with a black speckled pattern similar to the original covers. The new leather was then shaped in preparation for rebacking. It was paired overall with a Sharfix machine and around edges with paring knives to a thickness suitable for molding over the sewing supports. In the photograph on the bottom right on this slide, within the yellow circle, it's kind of hard to see, there are prior support fragments, which were exciting to discover. They measured about 2.5 millimeters in size, and these were used to help inform what supports I used for rebinding. So to reattach the boards, those new supports were frayed at the ends, and they were adhered to the outside of the boards beneath the lifted leather. The supports were adhered with a mix of wheat starch paste and a Jade 403 PVA. And the PVA was added just to help prevent the supports from slipping when I added the new leather that would be wet during rebacking. The boards were further attached with spine lining flanges. So these were the spine linings that extended off. And these were inserted beneath lifted marbled paste downs. The spine lining flanges consisted of 1 layer of cloth and 2 layers of kozo tissue and were really strong, yet flexible. Prepared leather was then used to reback the spine and to give it that shape over the sewing supports. We call it tying up in a sewing press like you saw with the thread looping over the leather. Here we are after treatment. So after treatment, the printed pages were preserved in a way that they were secure and they could flexibly function as they were once intended next to the handwritten manuscript leaves. And so using those parchment binding conservation techniques really were helpful to sew the encapsulation with the paper hinges next to other paper gatherings. And the unique encapsulated page format allowed us to retain the original covers and provide the user with a page turning experience that would not have otherwise been achieved with the traditional screw post encapsulated binding format. Here are a few before images on the top compared to after treatment images on the bottom. The right-hand column shows a handwritten fragment in the first leaf were once adhered overall to a paper support that was not original. They're now stored in an encapsulated sleeve, and you can see both sides of them. The new format exposes additional crossed out handwriting that wasn't visible in the prior format. And in the center column, the white interleaving sheet was replaced with the new custom toned in sheets. And in the final column, the leaves with the manuscript writing have brightened after the acidity in the paper was removed during washing and the iron gall ink was stabilized. And then just as a note for long-term storage, we put treatment documentations and any components that were removed during treatment, we could put them with the original leather spine in a stored folder within the cloth covered clamshell. So you can still access those if you're interested in seeing them. There are many people to thank who supported and played a role in the treatment of the 1526 Haggadah. Special mentions include Jessica Ebert, who conducted the treatment photographic documentation. Casey Jansen assisted in creating the sleeves for the model. And Chris Winovich constructed the final encapsulated pages that were used in the Haggadah treatment. And then following my attendance at an iron gall ink symposium, Kathy Lechuga, who's a conservator out of Indianapolis, she was integral in actually applying the practical hands-on process for performing the calcium phytate treatment. And then of course, Laurel Wolfson and Jordan Finken from Hebrew Union College provided all the historical information and just invaluable guidance. So thank you to all of them, and thank you for listening. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. I've listed my email address. And then I've brought a couple examples of encapsulations with paper hinges. I'm happy to show if that concept is kind of hard to grasp through this virtual experience. Great, yeah.
Thank you, Ashley. That was really fascinating. And I feel like this was the kind of tip of the iceberg of all the work that actually went into preserving this. Our first question was about the water treatments, if it was water. So you talked about what was the chemical compounds that were in the manuscript bath, but is that the same thing that was used for the printed papers? And kind of an additional question. So you had mentioned that you wanted to preserve the kind of the food stains and all of that bit that was historically useful. But so how do you retain that, but get rid of the rest of the stain that you kind of consider extraneous?
Yeah, so the printed leaves were washed in a pretty standard conservation treatment that we do for paper. So paper has just natural byproducts that age over time. It's why newspapers turn yellow. Luckily, these older papers are made with a much higher quality of paper fiber than newspapers. Newspapers have basically just pulped up tree lignin in them, whereas papers from this time period are going to be mostly, linens that were reused from clothing. So they're already higher quality, but they still age and they still yellow. So when we wash them in a bath, we will either use distilled water, deionized water, or in our lab, what we use is a reverse osmosis filtration system. And so it just removes all of those yellowing acidic products, and the pH of the paper naturally, when it's washed, will go from an acidic pH to a more neutral pH. And then in the final bath for the printed leaves, we do add a calcium carbonate to it, which is similar to the phytate treatment, but it's a totally different process where the calcium carbonate added to the bath is kind of imparted into the paper, and the paper absorbs it. And so it just helps buffer it going forward for the future. Whereas the wet work that we did for the manuscript, we were really targeting treatment for the iron gall ink. So the manuscript leaves were washed fully until the water ran clear. So whenever we are removing the acidity from the pages, the water turns yellow, and you can actually see it just come out. Kind of turns like a yellow, like you'd see from a tea bag or something. And so we wash it until there's no more yellow. So we do that before we treat for the iron gall ink process. So they were treated similarly, but with a few extra steps for the manuscript leaves. See, Abigail, I think
Unmuted. Yes, there we go. Okay, so another question here is, are these the same steps that you would use to restore any book, or is anything here specific to this Haggadah?
Yeah, I would say preserving the dirt is not something we always do. Usually, I would say for the public library, everything is covered in coal dust and soot, and that's all acidic, and it causes the pages, to degrade faster. So we want to get that off. We're not interested in preserving that part of the book's history. So we will surface clean to remove dirt. So that is different for this sort of project. And so in painting that dirt is something I would say a book conservator rarely does. But those lifted dirt areas were just so distracting. It seemed necessary in order to kind of honor the printing, so that your eyes were drawn to the importance of the object of the printing rather than, the dirt losses. I would say that this structure was totally out of scope of anything I've done, let alone what I feel like we do in the book conservation world. Because like I said, we will encapsulate pages, but it's really rare that you have to rebind two different size papers within the same covers. And it's problematic if I were to just rebind them without adding like a paper around the edge or that plastic support like you saw. The paper, the smaller sheets against the larger sheets would cause an impression on the manuscript leaves. So the outer edges would kind of drape over those smaller leaves, and it would be an issue over time. And also just make the manuscript leaves more vulnerable to breaking around the edges. So just kind of problem solving how to put these two different sizes together and not have that impression be an issue. I thought about, having a foam insert around that we could have added, or like I said, going ahead and inlaying the pages back into new paper leaves. But it just seemed like that there was a different way we could do it to preserve what was left of the original structure and making sure people knew what wasn't original, I guess. And so coming up with a way to sew the encapsulated leaves in a format where it's not side bound. So I don't know if people are aware of bookbinding terminology, but I would say if you think of Asian bindings and how they're sewn this way and they're side bound, you can't actually get to the gutter and see them. That wouldn't have worked to try and reuse the original leather covers, which is how encapsulated bindings are normally bound, with screws on the sides. So finding a way to add paper to the plastic and create an actual folio that we could sew through the middle into an actual historic structure, like it would have been. That I don't think that's never been done before in our field. So that I actually gave a presentation at a conservation conference last fall talking about this unique structure. So that was also very different.
You actually have a related question here about that. How did the mylar get attached to the hinging?
Great question. So that was where the model came in handy. It's a technique that isn't used a whole lot. Usually plastic is welded to plastic, And we do it with an ultrasonic welder in our lab. You can weld plastic with the traditional heat welds, but the ultrasonic welder allows us to do more specialized things like this. And so what happens is this strong Asian fibered paper is sandwiched between the two sheets of plastic in the encapsulation, and there's a weld line that runs all along the seam. And basically the paper is getting melted within that weld line. And so that holds it together. And then another sheet was welded on the other side of that. So also something that's not done very often, because normally you don't need paper in these sort of structures.
So one kind of more general question, how long did this whole process take and what is the cost for a project like this? And maybe this is a question you want to share with Jordan. We can unmute him.
Yeah, well, I will say this. This project spanned over COVID. So it took longer than probably it would have otherwise, like so many things during COVID. And so I was able to do some research. I would say the actual treatment itself took about 54 hours, not including the model or making the box. But that includes time such as photo documentation, creating the in sheets, doing the tear repairs and fills. The model itself took me about 10 hours of treatment, and the box made by Chris Winovich took him about 7 hours of treatment. So it was a lengthy project that when we do treatment, we don't, we're not able to do the whole thing from start to finish within like a day's time in terms of hour chunks. We have to do a little bit here, let it dry, and then work on another part, let it dry. And so there's a lot of waiting time. And so that's why it took as long as it did. Jordan, do you want to talk about the cost of treatment at all?
Yeah, so, well, the first thing I'd like to say is that I'm sort of in awe of the time, care, and dedication taken for a unique and uniquely developed treatment, not only to conserve the object, but to pay respect to that object's particular history and use. Also, just as a side note, you know, we've just had Passover, Seder, which is in my house routinely followed by seltzer and Tums. So I think this might be the first time in history that the Haggadah itself has had the same post-Seder treatment, as it were. But I don't think I want to get into the specifics of cost, but we did have a very generous donation for conservation of this particular object from David Price and Valerie Hotchkiss, who very generously donated. And it's the kind of opportunity that we have numerous rare books and manuscripts in our collection that while they may not need quite this level of intervention, do need conservation at various levels. So please do contact, be in touch with me or the library for opportunities for further work on those, for those possibilities. But it was, as I say, this was a very generous donation. So in answer to that question. Abigail?
All right, I think that is all of our questions for today. So I just want to thank Ashley again for this really fascinating presentation, and we will post again the link to this on our YouTube channel, and you can follow up with Ashley at the Preservation Lab if you have follow-up questions. So thank you all for joining us today, wishing everyone a happy rest of your Passover, and we'll see you next time. Take care.
Thank you.